So Denise, in the last session, you told us the basics of how we got our Bible today. We covered the short span of time when Jesus' life and ministry was shared through oral histories. Then we discussed the original writing of the New Testament, which all took place in a single lifetime after Jesus. And finally, we talked about the overwhelming number of manuscripts that make today's Bible so accurate to those originals. Now seems like a good time to dive more into detail because, for a lot of people, when they hear that the Bible has been copied by hand thousands of times, that just sounds like a lot of opportunities for it to change and evolve over time.
I agree with those sentiments, and I know that a lot of believers haven't really considered this topic before. Many skeptics say God must not care about the accuracy of the Bible. After all, aren't there numerous variations or errors in the manuscripts? Denise, could you shed some light on the differences between the manuscripts?
I'd be happy to. To start, let's think of a faithful, accurate, and complete Bible like a jigsaw puzzle. All of the thousands of biblical manuscripts make up the individual pieces to this puzzle. A common issue with old puzzles is that you have some pieces that are missing. But with the biblical manuscripts, instead of missing pieces, it has all the pieces to the puzzle with some extra pieces thrown in. That's the issue that modern Bible scholars face today. We have all the components to make up a complete and accurate Bible, but with extra variations.
I have no doubt that the experts have carefully put together the pieces to bring us a complete Bible. However, other religions claim to have had one single copy of their religious text that was faithfully passed down through the ages. To me, that seems like a valid reason to doubt the Bible we have today.
As odd as it sounds, the jigsaw puzzle nature of the Bible we have is actually a strength and not a weakness. Let me explain. Other religions view their holy texts like an original painting rather than a jigsaw puzzle. In other words, there were never two parallel manuscripts that had any differences. It was only one uncontested version at any given time. But that's not the full story. In order to get to that point, there had to be one central authority saying, this is the true religious book, and this one next to it is a counterfeit. This strong authority position leads to censorship, religious manuscripts being burned or erased, and actually leaves more room to believe their religious texts were maliciously altered over time. If we only had one official version of the Bible, I would be more skeptical because it would mean someone has been deciding what is authentic for me. As we've already said, though, the transmission of the Bible was the complete opposite. Copies were made in a careful manner, although they were made and distributed freely. And here are a couple of reasons why that reinforces the accuracy of the Bible. First, it's honest and transparent. The transmission was decentralized, so there could be no governing authority to alter the original texts. Second, the competing manuscripts hold each other accountable. We can see where one manuscript is in error if a dozen more all say the same thing.
You've mentioned a couple times now that the manuscripts we have today don't always agree. There are some differences between them, which scholars call variations. So, what is considered a manuscript variation or error?
This is an area that gets exaggerated by opponents of Christianity, which is why we've devoted a whole session to discussing them. Some scholars assert there are hundreds of thousands of these variations or errors in the biblical manuscript. So let's define what we mean. A variation or error is any difference between manuscripts, except in the case of punctuation or capitalization. That's it, literally any variation.
So, it's obviously a pretty flexible label, but you give the impression that most of these are pretty benign. Could you walk us through some examples?
Sure. I don't know anyone who's made the claim that the biblical manuscripts are perfect and flawless, but it's important to look at what makes up these errors. This would be things like misspellings or even two legitimate variations in spelling. For example, some manuscripts spell John with one N, some use two N's. Another example of a variation would be word order. Greek is known as an inflected language, meaning word order is not as rigid as English. There's a cliche in biblical scholarship that there are over 300 ways of saying a simple phrase like John loves Mary in Greek. So another huge percentage of these variations between manuscripts fall under word order. Other minor variations are caused by simple writing errors, which are also easily resolved. This would be something like duplicating lines, skipping a line, or accidentally scribbling on the page. Even a dot of ink bleeding onto the page could be considered a textual variation in manuscripts.
Okay, so it's really easy to see how some of these variations are self-resolving through common sense. Roughly how many of these can be easily dismissed, and how many present an actual challenge to the textual critics and Bible scholars?
Something like 90% of the supposed hundreds of thousands of variations are so small you could read over them without a problem. Here's a quote from Bruce Metzger in his book, The Text of the New Testament: Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. It is important to note that the great majority of textual variants are of no great significance. Most of them involve only minor changes in spelling, word order, or the style of writing, and do not affect the substance of Christian doctrine or practice. Now for the second part of your question. What about the rest of the variants, the roughly 10% where there might be a noticeable difference between two manuscripts? Still, these are able to be resolved, just not as easily. This is what we call textual criticism, and it's the process of sorting through the thousands of manuscripts and finding the best phrase that most likely matches the original Bible.
And what sort of criteria do they use to determine the text of the original?
It's a very long process that requires a lot of expertise and discussion, but here's the low-hanging fruit. What do the majority of manuscripts say? If one manuscript says this, but 500 all say something else, scholars will go with the popular consensus. Another important factor is, what do the oldest manuscripts say? A manuscript from the year AD 120 is far more likely to be original than from the year AD 900. If there's a tie between two manuscripts of equal seniority, which version uses the fewest words? Additions to the text are generally more likely than omissions. There are a lot of others that would take longer to describe, like geographic distribution, whether the same phrase was repeated on multiple continents; patristic citation, which looks at external writings from the first few centuries to corroborate a manuscript; text type, or manuscript quality, just to name a few.
Okay, so we can see that there's a legitimate, refined, and complex system to produce an accurate version of the original text. So give us the bottom line, Denise. How confident are we that despite the number of variants, we have a really accurate modern day Bible?
I'm persuaded without a doubt that our Bibles are more accurate than any other document from ancient history. It's nothing short of a miracle that we've been able to verify with confidence that our Bibles are almost guaranteed to be what Christians read in the first century. Even the most skeptical critics admit that today's Bibles are at least 99.5% accurate to what was originally written. In our next session, we're going to talk about that other 0.5% and examine the claim that our Bible has been added to.